let's look at, or let's talk about some of those like expenses and liabilities. I think some are probably easier than others to understand. Like if I'm buying material for a re-roof, it's probably fairly easy to tie that material to a specific job. What about some of those expenses or liabilities that aren't job specific? And you brought it up in your first answer when you talked about a CRM and QuickBooks. Those things aren't free, so I've got to apply those somewhere. I've got, insurance, I've got car, I've got vehicle, like I've got my office.
Yes.
How do I apply those across jobs, or do I worry about applying those across jobs, or what does that look like?
Yeah, no, great question. So when it's, I always say all those things you listed, that's your overhead. That's what it costs. And most common in our industry, those costs are set, whether you do 5 million or 10 million or 1 million or 2 million, wherever you're set up to operate for the year, you find that most of your rent, even your employees, you're set up to do a varying amount of revenue. We're not similar to other industries where you have to kind of increase your overhead in correlation to how much revenue you do. You could have a storm hit and be able to, with your pretty similar overhead, operate just as effectively, and vice versa. So I always say I really like to be clear cut on those two distinctions. You have job costs that are 100% attributable to jobs. So if you do 2 million versus 1 million, your job costs are going to go up by double. Then you have your overhead that you're tracking with intentionality to what we plan to budget, right? What do we plan to spend in these different overhead, like you said, the rent, your admin or production staff. You think of those softwares and services that you do, insurance, all of those costs are what I bucket into overhead expenses.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. So those are, I just say, if I'm a business owner, like my overhead is X, do you usually try to say that is, because that's the old 10 and 10, right? So do I usually try to say that it is a percentage of what revenue I plan to do, or do I need to have that as a concrete, like I anticipate my overhead for the year to be X number of dollars?
Yeah. If you're maybe a retail company that's pretty stagnant in your sales, and you know pretty much what you're going to do, getting into those percentages, I don't have a problem with that. I tend to push back to percentages of overhead only because of that point I told you. Usually when you're planning, and especially if you're wanting to invest in strategy for your company, usually you want to grow. That growth could happen in varying paces depending on storms, if you're in insurance, or depending on other factors. And that is where I have a little bit of a tug at or a poke at to say, I don't like throwing percentages on these overheads, because going into the year what you're set up to do. And so meaning you're not going to instantly, because, okay, now our revenue, we have this storm and our sales team are going to each sell double what they had goals to sell. You're not going to need to go buy a new office lease and double your office lease cost. Right? You're not going to necessarily need to double your vehicle cost if you have vehicles. So there's a lot of those costs that I see more as fixed cost in that way. And so I always say the most, I think, reliable way to hold your overhead spending accountable comes down to budgeting, right? Like I want to be able to budget what I'm going to do in this based off of what I plan. Then let's let our sales and our production team, maybe if I explain it this way, I break it down into 3 components as simple components. You have the revenue amount, which when you mention sales is not your revenue. Sales is your pipeline for revenue, but your revenue is only when you complete the work. Because your sales team may be knocking it out of the park, but if your production team can't produce at that rate, do you get what I mean? Like you see that disconnect. And so I say your sales is a very key indicator. You want to be watching those tightly. But your revenue is even a stronger indicator to the overall health. So that revenue bucket is one of those financial components. You have how profitable that revenue was that you completed. That's your gross profit margin that we're talking about. And then you have your overhead. Those are the only 3 components to your net profit. So if you structure your strategy to track these things with accuracy, something's got to give. right? So if your revenue is not performing at the way you thought it was, either you need to sell them a lot higher and make a bigger margin, or you need to decrease your overhead, and vice versa.